300 rabbits. That is what one woman brought home on the same afternoon she signed over the most valuable piece of equipment on her farm, a combine harvester that had taken her family 11 years to pay off, and that her neighbors considered the single most important asset a grain farmer in Millbrook County could own. The dealer she traded with told her afterward, to more than one person, that he'd felt obligated to ask her twice whether she was certain, and that both times she'd said yes without looking up from the paperwork. Nobody in Millbrook County thought the trade made any sense. Nobody, for the next 4 years, was especially quiet about that opinion. By the time those 4 years were up, the farm that had looked like it was dismantling itself one asset at a time was producing more net income per acre than any grain operation in the county. The soil under it was the most documented case of rapid organic matter improvement the county extension office had ever formally recorded. And the woman who had traded a combine for 300 rabbits was the person the county's largest grain farmer had driven out to see, hat in hand, to ask for advice on why his own soil was failing him while hers kept improving. Raymond Holt had farmed the most acreage in Millbrook County for 23 years, controlled the county's only commercial grain drying and storage facility, and sat on the County Agricultural Advisory Committee that set the extension program's research priorities and determined which farming practices got promoted, which got tolerated, and which got quietly discouraged through the mechanism of simply never being mentioned in any official county publication. He had watched Lena Cross trade her combine with the same expression most of the county had used, a mixture of genuine concern and private satisfaction that a young woman who had always done things slightly differently had finally done something different enough to confirm everyone's worries about her. And he had never, in 4 years of watching her rabbit operation from a distance, asked himself whether he was looking at a mistake or a plan. None of that had happened yet on the cold November morning, when Lena Cross drove to the equipment dealer with a combine that represented 11 years of her family's debt payments, signed the title over to a man who could not quite believe she was serious, and drove home with the back of her truck full of wire cages. To understand how 300 rabbits became the mechanism of the most significant soil and financial transformation in Millbrook County's recent agricultural history, you have to start with the land itself, and with the man who had spent 2 decades making sure that the most profitable way to farm in Millbrook County was the way he happened to farm it. Millbrook County had never been a place that rewarded a young woman for departing from what its largest operator considered the correct approach to agriculture. And the story of Lena Cross and her rabbits became, in the years after the transformation, was impossible to ignore. The kind of thing people in the county told new farmers, specifically when those new farmers were being told by someone else that there was only one right way to do things. Millbrook County lay flat and wide through its central valley, excellent grain farming ground that had been producing corn and soybeans continuously for most of the 20th century. And the soil that had once been dark and deep with organic matter had been thinning steadily for the past 30 years under the kind of continuous tillage and synthetic fertilization regime that produced reliable yields and reliable soil degradation in roughly equal measure. Raymond Holt had inherited his father's 600 acres in the mid-1970s and spent the following 2 decades expanding to nearly 1,200 through a combination of land purchases and rental arrangements, building simultaneously the county's only commercial grain drying and storage facility. A business that meant almost every bushel of corn and soybeans produced within 20 miles eventually passed through his equipment at his pricing before it reached any other buyer. He sat on the Agricultural Advisory Committee that set the county extension program's research and promotion priorities, a body whose recommendations had aligned, for most of his tenure on it, with the kind of high-input grain production that his storage facility was optimized to handle and that his own operation was built around. People in Millbrook County had a way of describing Raymond Holt's influence on local agriculture that sounded like admiration until you examined it closely enough to notice that the county's extension bulletin had not once, in 23 years of Raymond's committee tenure, published a feature on any alternative soil management approach, and that farmers who had tried cover crops or reduced tillage or any significant departure from the county's dominant grain production model had tended to find their relationships with the storage facility slightly less convenient than those who hadn't. Lena Cross had taken over her family's 92 acres when her father's health had forced him to step back 3 years earlier, inheriting with the land a set of soil test results that told a story the county's extension bulletin had been carefully not telling for years. The organic matter content of Millbrook County's average grain field had dropped from roughly 4% in the county's oldest recorded tests to under 1.5% in the most recent measurements, a decline that translated directly into reduced water retention, increased fertilizer dependency, and declining long-term yield potential that the annual application of synthetic inputs was masking rather than addressing. She had read those tests carefully. She had read the research on what it actually took to rebuild organic matter in depleted agricultural soil, a process that took years and required biological activity that synthetic inputs could not substitute for. And she had spent 6 months working out a plan before she walked into the equipment dealer and asked what he would give her for the combine. The dealer offered her more than she'd expected, because the combine was in good condition and demand for used equipment was strong that fall, and the figure he named was enough to cover the rabbits, the hutch infrastructure she needed to build, and the small amount of additional fencing the expanded pasture rotation she was planning would require. He said he still needed to ask her twice, not because the numbers didn't work, but because he had known the Cross family for 15 years, and the combine had always been the centerpiece of the farm's equipment lineup, the asset that made everything else possible, and he wanted to be sure she understood what she was giving up. She told him she understood exactly what she was giving up and that she decided it was the right exchange, which was the most she said about it to anyone that day or for quite some time afterward. Driving home with 300 rabbits in wire cages in the back of her truck, she passed 3 neighbors on the county road, and 2 of them slowed down to look at what she was hauling with the kind of focused attention that precedes a conversation at the feed store, which is to say the kind of attention that precedes a story that will be repeated with embellishments for months. She did not stop to explain herself to either of them, because explaining herself before the results were visible would have required her to defend a theory against a consensus, and she had always found results to be considerably more effective than arguments where farming was concerned. The 3rd neighbor she passed was Raymond Holt himself, heading the other direction in his truck, and he slowed enough to take in the cages and the rabbits and the expression on Lena's face that gave nothing away, and then he drove on. And he mentioned to his wife that evening that the Cross girl had apparently done something inadvisable with her combine, which was more or less the same thing he mentioned to the counter at his storage facility the following week and to the advisory committee the week after that. Darla Keene had known Lena since high school and had farmed the ground next to hers for 7 years, and when she drove over the following spring to see how the rabbit operation was looking, her honest assessment was that it looked like a great deal of work for a result she couldn't yet evaluate, which she delivered in the direct way she delivered most things, standing at the fence of the new hutch yard with her arms crossed and an expression that was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. 92 acres of grain ground, she said, and you traded the thing that harvests it for 300 rabbits. Lena, I've been trying to figure out the math on this for 6 months, and I can't make it work. Lena told her the math worked differently than it appeared to because the rabbits were not replacing the combine's harvesting function, but rather the soil's productivity function, a distinction that she could see from Darla's expression was not landing as clearly as she'd intended. She tried again. The soil on this farm is at 1.2% organic matter, she said. At 1.2, I'm spending more on inputs every year just to hold yield flat, and the yield is eventually going to drop anyway, because there's not enough biological life in the ground to process what I'm putting on it. The rabbits produce manure that I can apply at volumes that would build organic matter back faster than any other method I've found that I can afford. In 4 years, if I'm right, the soil on this farm will be different enough that the math changes completely. Darla looked at the rabbits for a long moment. And if you're wrong, she said, if you're wrong, you've traded your combine for compost. Lena told her she wouldn't be wrong. Darla drove home, not quite convinced and not quite dismissive either, which was a more useful response than the full dismissal she'd been prepared to deliver, and she found herself, over the following months, paying more attention to Lena's fields than she'd expected to. The person who finally put a formal number on what Lena was doing was Dr. Annette Sowers, a soil biologist at the State Agricultural University who ran a program studying rapid organic matter rehabilitation in depleted grain soils, and who had been looking for a working farm case study for 2 years when a mutual contact passed her Lena's name in the spring of the second year. Sowers drove out on a Tuesday in April, took 12 soil cores across Lena's fields at 2 depths, and spent the drive back to the university doing calculations that made her pull over once to recheck her arithmetic. She called Lena that evening and asked how much manure she was applying per acre annually. And when Lena told her, Sowers said quietly that the number was considerably higher than she'd expected for a 300-animal operation and asked how she was managing the distribution. Lena explained the rotation system she'd designed, moving the rabbit operation in a circuit that spread the manure input evenly across the full acreage over a 2-year cycle, a system she designed herself from first principles and that had taken the better part of a year to get working smoothly. Sowers was quiet for a moment. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Your organic matter readings at the 6-inch depth are already at 1.9%, up from the 1.2 you started with 22 months ago. In my research program, the fastest documented organic matter increase in a depleted grain soil under any management system over a comparable period is 0.4%. You're showing 0.7. With rabbit manure applied at this volume and rotation, the microbial activity data I'm seeing is unlike anything I've documented in a working farm context." She told Lena she would like to set up a formal monitoring program on the property, with quarterly soil testing at multiple depths and a yield comparison against neighboring fields using the same crop varieties, which would produce the kind of documented, peer-reviewable data that could demonstrate what the rabbit system was doing in terms that the county extension program and the agricultural research community would have to take seriously. Lena agreed and asked Sowers to keep the formal program off the county's official radar for the time being, which Sowers understood without requiring explanation, because she had presented enough unconventional agricultural research in enough county extension settings to have a clear picture of how Raymond Holt's committee would respond to being told the county's soil management orthodoxy was producing measurably inferior results. Lena did not tell Raymond Holt or anyone connected to his storage facility or the advisory committee what Annette Sowers had told her that spring, and she made no changes to how her operation looked from the county road, continuing the same rabbit management rotation and field work that she'd been doing since the first year, keeping the hutch infrastructure modest and the visible activity around it unremarkable to anyone driving past who hadn't been specifically invited to look closely. Sowers' monitoring program ran quietly through the 3rd and 4th years, producing quarterly data that Lena kept in a folder in her kitchen alongside her own soil test records and the yield data from the first 2 harvests, numbers that she had contracted with a harvesting service to bring in since trading away the combine, a decision that had cost her more per bushel than owning the combine outright would have in a normal season, but that was still when she ran the full accounting against the soil improvement and the reduced input costs her improving organic matter was making possible, the right side of the ledger. By the end of the 3rd year, her fertilizer spend per acre had dropped by 22% as her soil's biological activity increased its ability to process and retain nutrients without synthetic supplementation, and her yield, contrary to what the county's consensus had predicted for a farm that had traded its combine for rabbits, had held flat rather than declining, which was not yet a vindication but was considerably better than the county had expected. Darla Keene, who had been watching from the neighboring fence line with the focused attention of a farmer who has spent 3 years deciding whether she was watching a mistake or a plan, came over in the 4th spring and asked Lena, very directly, whether she would share her soil test numbers. Lena shared them. Darla drove home and ordered a soil test of her own fields that afternoon. Raymond Holt noticed something was different at the Cross Farm sometime in the middle of the 4th year, or more precisely noticed that the farm's relationship with his storage facility had changed in ways he hadn't tracked carefully enough when they were happening. The combine trade had meant contracting out harvest, which meant the grain from Lena's fields was going to the harvesting contractor's preferred storage contact rather than to his facility, a diversion he hadn't paid close attention to because 92 acres was not a volume that moved his numbers significantly. What he noticed in the 4th year was a magazine, a regional agricultural publication he received at the office, that ran a feature on emerging soil health case studies in the state's grain belt, one of which was a lightly anonymized account of a rabbit-based organic matter rehabilitation program on a depleted grain farm that had produced documented organic matter increases of nearly 1% in under 4 years and input cost reductions of over 20%, with a byline crediting Dr. Annette Sowers of the State Agricultural University. He read it twice and then made 3 phone calls. And by the end of the day, he had confirmed that the anonymized farm was Lena Cross's 92 acres in Millbrook County, and that the woman he had spent 4 years treating as an object lesson in inadvisable equipment decisions had been running a formal university monitoring program on her soil for 2 of those years. He called the advisory committee chair the following week and asked to add a soil health agenda item to the next meeting, framing it as a general topic, which the chair agreed to. And he spent several days preparing language about the importance of rigorous, county-appropriate research before any alternative soil management approaches were promoted through extension channels. Careful language built on the assumption that he would be walking into that meeting with the only formal data in the room. He had not asked Annette Sowers' office whether she had been invited to the meeting. She had. The advisory committee meeting that fall was scheduled as a routine quarterly session and ended as something considerably more significant, because Annette Sowers arrived with 4 years of quarterly soil monitoring data, peer-reviewed documentation of the organic matter trajectory on Lena Cross's farm, and a comparison dataset pulled from the county's own extension records showing the organic matter trends on the county's average grain fields over the same 4-year period, a comparison that required no interpretation to understand. The county's average fields had continued the same slow organic matter decline they had been on for 30 years, while the Cross farm had reversed that trend by a margin that the county's own extension director, sitting at the same table, said was the largest documented single-farm improvement in the county's recorded history. Raymond presented his prepared language about county-appropriate research and the risks of promoting and proven alternative approaches, and it landed with the particular hollow quality of prepared remarks that have been overtaken by the evidence already on the table. Lena laid her 4 years of input cost records beside Sowers' soil data, a set of numbers that showed the direct financial relationship between organic matter improvement and reduced fertilizer dependency, in plain arithmetic anyone in the room could follow. And then she said nothing further, because the documents said everything that needed saying more clearly than she could have said it in a speech. The committee voted to commission a county-wide soil health assessment using Sowers' methodology, the first formal departure from the Extension program's existing research framework in Raymond Holt's tenure on the committee, and the motion passed with Raymond abstaining rather than voting against it, which was the most honest signal anyone in that room had seen from him in years about where he actually stood. Word of the committee meeting and what had been presented at it moved through Millbrook County the way it always does in a small agricultural community, through the feed store counter and the equipment dealer lot and the storage facility office, and by planting season of the following year 3 neighboring farms had begun inquiring about rabbit-based manure management systems, 2 of them specifically citing Sowers' data, and one of them, Darla Keene, who had already had her soil tested and already knew what she was going to find. Raymond Holt did not change his storage facility's pricing structure or resign from the advisory committee, because neither of those things was required by the situation, and his grain operation remained, by volume, the largest in the county for years afterward. What changed was the committee's research agenda, which in the 2 years following the meeting began including soil health indicators alongside yield metrics for the first time in the Extension program's history, a shift that several younger farmers in the county described as the most practically useful change they'd seen in the program in their farming careers. Raymond drove out to Lena Cross's farm in the following spring, parking at the same gate where he'd once slowed down on the county road to look at a truck full of rabbit cages with the expression of a man watching a mistake happen in real time. He asked her, with considerably less of his old certainty in his voice, whether she'd be willing to share her rotation schedule and her manure application methodology, because he had 2 fields in his own operation showing organic matter decline that his current input program was not reversing, and he wanted to understand what she was doing that he wasn't. She told him she would share everything she had, on the same terms she'd already offered Darla and anyone else who'd asked, and didn't make him stand at the gate acknowledging what 4 years of dismissal had cost him, because making people acknowledge things they already know was not how she'd ever managed to actually change anything. The lesson Millbrook County eventually settled on from the whole affair was not the one Raymond Holt had spent 23 years implicitly teaching, which was that the right way to farm was the way the county's largest operator had always farmed it. It was something simpler and considerably less comfortable. that a community's consensus about what constitutes a good agricultural decision is only as reliable as the quality of the evidence that consensus was built on, and that when the evidence base has been quietly shaped for decades by the interests of the person who benefits most from a particular approach, the consensus is going to be wrong in exactly the ways that the dissenting observations are right. Lena Cross had traded a combine for 300 rabbits and spent 4 years building the kind of evidence that the county's own extension program had been designed not to produce. And when that evidence finally sat on the advisory committee's table beside the county's own 30-year soil decline data, the gap between what everyone had agreed was happening and what was actually happening was legible to anyone in the room who was willing to read it honestly. Drive past the Cross farm today, and the difference between 92 acres of actively managed rabbit rotation and the grain fields around it is visible even from the county road if you know what you're looking at. The darker soil where the fields have been tilled, the slightly denser canopy in a dry year, the way the ground holds color longer into an August heat wave than the surrounding fields do. The combine she traded away has probably been resold twice since then and is working someone else's grain somewhere in the county, doing its job the way it always did, and Lena contracts the harvesting every fall the same way she has since year one. And the math, as she told Darla Keene it would, now works completely differently than it did when 300 rabbits came home in the back of a truck on a cold November afternoon and the whole county decided it was watching the worst deal in their farming memory. They were not watching a deal at all. They were watching the first step in a 4-year soil rehabilitation plan. And the only thing that made it look like a bad deal was not understanding what the plan actually was. If this story landed for you, hit like before you go, because it genuinely helps more people find it. Share it with someone who has ever been told their plan didn't make sense by someone who hadn't actually read the plan. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because there is a new one every week. And down in the comments, tell us about a time you made a decision that looked wrong from the outside and turned out to be exactly right. We read every single one.